The scent of aged mahogany and fresh sawdust had been the very breath in Harrison Caldwell's lungs for 32 long years. He was a man of 71, built like the sturdy oak trees he had felled and shaped throughout his entire life. His hands were a map of deep calluses, rough scars, and ingrained oil, telling the silent story of a master carpenter who had poured every ounce of his soul into his craft. Yet on this bleak Tuesday afternoon, those hands did not rest on a familiar workbench or hold a trusted chisel. They lay flat and perfectly still on the polished glass surface of a conference table in downtown Blackwood. The air in the room was suffocating. Across the table sat the two people who had just systematically dismantled his entire existence. Eleanor, his wife of nearly 40 years, sat with her posture rigidly straight, her eyes fixed out the window, as if staring at a patch of gray sky was vastly more important than the man she was erasing from her life. She wore a pristine white coat, perfectly pressed, not a single fiber out of place. Beside her sat Preston, their biological son. Preston wore a sharp, custom-tailored navy blue suit that seemed to absorb the cold, fluorescent light of the room. He was a lawyer, a man who traded in words and loopholes rather than sweat and timber. "It is just a matter of structural necessity, Dad," Preston said smoothly, his tone entirely devoid of warmth. "This is about tax optimization and minimizing liability. You understand, do you not?" Harrison did not answer. He simply stared at the stack of legal documents pushed toward him. For the past 3 years, Preston had been bringing him papers to sign, using his deep understanding of corporate law to weave a web of deceit right under his trusting nose. There were documents to restructure the workshop, papers to shield their personal assets, forms to create holding companies. Harrison, a man who understood the honest geometry of a right angle and the absolute truth of a plumb line, had trusted his own flesh and blood. He had signed where he was told, believing he was securing their family's future. He was wrong. The final divorce decree lay on top of the pile, the ink barely dry. Through a labyrinth of legal maneuvers, Eleanor and Preston had managed to transfer the deed to the house, the ownership of the sprawling 5-acre property, and total control of the incredibly lucrative carpentry business entirely into their names. They had legally stripped him to the bone. Harrison picked up the heavy brass pen. He did not yell. He did not slam his calloused fists against the fragile glass table. He did not shed a single pathetic tear or beg for the mercy of the family he had fed, clothed, and protected for 32 years. He signed his name with slow, deliberate strokes. "We need you out of the property by 6 o'clock tonight," Eleanor stated sharply, finally turning her icy gaze toward him. "The new security gates are being installed tomorrow morning." Harrison slowly placed the pen down. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long, heavy shadow over the two of them. He adjusted his faded flannel shirt, buttoned his worn denim jacket, and turned his back on them without uttering a single syllable. The silence was deafening. The temperature had dropped to a bitter 40 degrees Fahrenheit by the time Harrison returned to the property that was no longer his. The wind howled through the towering pines, carrying the harsh chill of an impending winter. He walked slowly past the massive steel-framed workshop he had built with his own 2 hands, running his rough fingertips along the exterior wooden panels for the very last time. Inside that building were custom table saws, thousands of board feet of premium lumber, and the echoing memories of his prime. Now it belonged to a man in a blue suit who did not know a flathead screwdriver from a chisel. He walked to the driveway where his sole remaining possession sat waiting. It was a rusted, beat-up pickup truck that had seen over 200,000 miles of hard road. The engine knocked, the heater was broken, and the driver's side door squeaked in protest every time it was opened.
In the cargo bed, exposed to the biting wind, lay the pathetic sum of his life's accumulation. There were exactly 2 battered suitcases holding his worn work clothes. Beside them sat a single, heavily taped cardboard box. It contained nothing of monetary value, just a few faded photographs, a tarnished silver locket, and the fragile keepsakes of his late mother, Miriam. That was it. 32 years of backbreaking labor, of inhaling sawdust until his lungs burned, of bleeding over saw blades to build an empire, had been reduced to a few pounds of luggage in the back of a dying truck. Harrison reached into the front pocket of his faded jeans and pulled out his worn leather wallet. He flipped it open, staring quietly at the worn paper bills inside. $114. That was the exact, pathetic amount of cash remaining to his name. The bank accounts were frozen or emptied, the credit cards canceled, the life savings legally siphoned away into offshore accounts managed by his son. He slid the wallet back into his pocket, his expression completely unreadable. A weaker man would have collapsed onto the cold gravel. A lesser man would have screamed at the dark sky, cursing the heavens and begging for an explanation. Harrison merely opened the creaking door of the truck. He climbed into the driver's seat, the cold vinyl biting through his denim jeans. He pushed the key into the ignition and turned it. The old engine sputtered, coughed violently, and then roared to a shaky life, vibrating through the floorboards and up into his heavy work boots. He shifted the gear to drive. He did not look in the rearview mirror as he rolled down the long, winding driveway of the estate. He kept his eyes locked dead ahead on the cracked asphalt, driving away from the ghosts of a family that had never truly loved him. The night swallowed him whole. He drove for hours, aimlessly navigating the dark, empty county roads of rural Kentucky. The heater blew nothing but frigid air, leaving the cabin feeling like an icebox. The fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty, mocking the $114 sitting uselessly in his pocket. Exhaustion finally overtook him as he pulled the old truck behind a dimly lit abandoned gas station on the outskirts of Blackwood. He turned off the engine, plunging the cabin into a heavy, oppressive silence. He wrapped his thick, calloused hands around the freezing steering wheel, resting his heavy forehead against his knuckles. He closed his eyes. Falling asleep on the cold steering wheel with $114 pathetic dollars in his wallet, Harrison had absolutely no idea that an accidental turn the next morning was about to lead him to the hiding place of a historically shocking secret.
For 14 brutal days, Harrison Caldwell existed within the cramped, freezing dimensions of his truck cab. The temperature plunged to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the rusted metal roof into an icebox and frosting the inside of the windshield with thick white crystals. He survived on stale bread, cheap black coffee, and the sheer, unyielding stubbornness of a man who refused to break. Every morning he unfolded his stiff, aching joints, his 71-year-old bones protesting the severe lack of a mattress. His back screamed in agony, his fingers grew stiff from the biting cold, and the profound silence of the empty gas station parking lot threatened to crush his spirit. He did not complain. He simply buttoned his faded denim jacket, stepped out into the bitter wind, and walked. Blackwood was a dying town, a forgotten stretch of rural Kentucky where boarded-up storefronts vastly outnumbered the living. He wandered past broken streetlights, cracked sidewalks, overgrown weeds, and rusted chain-link fences. He walked for miles, letting the steady rhythm of his heavy boots against the concrete keep his mind sharp and his heart beating. It was on the afternoon of his 15th day on the streets that he saw it. It sat at the end of a forgotten alleyway. It was an old, dilapidated picture-framing studio, abandoned and left to rot for 9 long years.
The front windows were completely shattered, the roof shingles were peeling away like dead skin, and the wooden porch sagged heavily under its own weight. To the ordinary passerby, it was a worthless pile of garbage, a blighted, decaying eyesore waiting for the inevitable swing of a wrecking ball. But Harrison was not an ordinary passerby. He was a master craftsman who had spent a lifetime reading the grain of wood. He saw the bones. He looked right past the peeling paint, the broken glass, the creeping ivy, and the thick layer of filth. His expert eyes measured the sturdy 6x6 timber posts holding the frame together, noting that the foundation was still perfectly level, despite nearly a decade of brutal neglect. The main structure was remarkably solid, spanning roughly 2,000 square feet of highly usable space. Hanging crookedly in the front window, barely visible behind a thick layer of grime, was a water-damaged cardboard sign with a handwritten phone number. Harrison pulled a handful of loose coins from his pocket. He walked 2 blocks down the avenue to a rusted payphone outside a desolate, empty laundromat. The quarters dropped into the metal slot with a hollow clatter. He dialed the number, his heavily calloused thumb pressing the cold metal buttons. And woman answered on the 3rd ring, her voice laced with deep exhaustion and severe annoyance. She was the daughter of the previous owner, an old woman named Martha, who had been moved into an assisted living facility years ago. The daughter lived hundreds of miles away and absolutely despised the decaying property, viewing it as a massive liability and a towering tax burden she desperately wanted to discard. "I want to buy the shop," Harrison stated calmly. The woman on the other end let out a bitter, cynical laugh, explaining loudly that the property had negative equity, thousands of dollars in unpaid back taxes, and a mountain of structural code violations. She told him, without a single shred of hesitation, that she would sign over the deed to literally anyone willing to take the legal nightmare off her hands, just to be free of the relentless paperwork. $14. Harrison offered quietly, stating the exact amount he was willing to part with while keeping an even $100 in his wallet for basic survival. "Fine," she muttered bitterly. "It is your problem now." By sunset, the meager transaction was complete, and Harrison stood alone on the creaking wooden porch of his new domain. He had traded $14 for a mountain of dust, rot, and quiet isolation. The harsh winter wind howled through the broken glass, sending a violent shiver down his spine as he stepped over the threshold. His heavy work boots crunched loudly against the debris-covered floorboards, echoing into the vast emptiness. He was completely alone. He spent the first 3 hours sweeping a small 10 by 10 foot corner in the front room, using a broken tree branch he had found in the alleyway. He dragged his heavy cardboard box of keepsakes inside, setting it carefully against the cracked, yellowing plaster wall. The smell of mildew, stale air, and wet rot was utterly overwhelming. He unrolled a cheap plastic tarp over the hard, unforgiving wooden floor, preparing to sleep indoors for the first time in 2 weeks. It was a pathetic, empty existence. Yet, as Harrison knelt on the thin tarp to arrange his rolled-up denim jacket as a makeshift pillow, a strange draft caught his attention. He paused, his sharp eyes scanning the deep shadows of the massive empty workshop. The draft carried a very faint, deeply familiar scent, the distinct earthy aroma of dried linseed oil, turpentine, and aged canvas. He stood up slowly, pulling a small battery-powered flashlight from his pocket. He walked deeper into the darkness. His boots echoed ominously through the hollow corridor as he navigated past overturned workbenches, shattered picture frames, and rotting wooden shelves. At the very end of the narrow hallway, hidden entirely from the main storefront, his flashlight beam struck a solid, heavy oak door. It was covered in a thick, gray veil of spiderwebs, looking exactly as though no human hand had touched it in 9 long years. He stepped closer. Securing the heavy oak door to the doorframe was a massive industrial steel padlock, completely eaten through with dark orange rust. Harrison reached out with his rough, calloused fingers, tracing the cold metal of the lock, sensing the heavy weight of the secrets buried behind the wood.
The morning sun bled through the cracked, grime-covered windows of the abandoned studio, casting long, sharp shadows across the dusty floorboards. Harrison awoke with the dawn, his joints aching from the unforgiving hardness of the wooden planks beneath his thin tarp, but his mind was already moving with the steady, calculated precision of a master builder. He did not waste a single moment feeling sorry for himself, nor did he dwell on the warm, luxurious bed his ex-wife and son were likely waking up in miles away. He had work to do. He walked out to his rusted truck, his heavy boots crunching against the frozen gravel, and pulled a battered yellow tape measure and a heavy steel crowbar from his toolbox. The air was a crisp 32 degrees Fahrenheit, biting at his exposed cheeks, but he hardly noticed the cold. He returned to the interior of the shop, his eyes scanning the structural integrity of his $14 investment with the fierce, scrutinizing gaze of a man who had spent 30 decades erecting houses from the ground up. It was a masterpiece of endurance. Beneath the thick, suffocating layers of dirt, cobwebs, dead leaves, and discarded trash, the original flooring was laid with solid 2-inch thick planks of old-growth maple. He dropped to one knee, using his calloused thumb to scrape away a patch of hardened grime, revealing the tight, flawless grain of the wood beneath. The walls, though stained a sickly yellow from years of moisture and neglect, were framed with sturdy pine studs that had not yielded a single inch to rot or termites. The bones were perfect. While Preston sat in a climate-controlled high-rise office building calculating ruthless tax margins and legal loopholes, Harrison stood quietly in the freezing dust, measuring the undeniable truth of load-bearing walls and perfectly plumb corners. He spent the next 3 hours pacing the 2,000 square feet of the main room, noting every broken pane of glass, every warped piece of baseboard, and every rusty nail that needed pulling. His mind cataloged the necessary repairs in a long, methodical list of lumber, screws, plaster, and paint. Then he remembered the door. He walked down the narrow, shadowed corridor, his heavy steel crowbar gripped tightly in his right hand. The massive oak door stood exactly as he had left it the night before, completely obscured by the thick gray veil of undisturbed spiderwebs. The heavy industrial padlock hung heavily from the rusted steel hasp, a stubborn guardian that had successfully kept the world at bay for 9 long years. He did not hesitate. Harrison wedged the curved, forged edge of the crowbar behind the locking mechanism, firmly planting his boots shoulder-width apart on the maple floor. He applied steady, relentless downward pressure, utilizing the mechanical advantage of leverage rather than raw, chaotic force. The old metal groaned in protest, a harsh scraping sound that echoed loudly down the empty hallway. He leaned his entire weight of 210 pounds into the steel bar. The hasp snapped in two. The dry, violent crack sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence of the abandoned building. Harrison pulled the broken padlock free, letting the heavy chunk of rusted iron drop to the floorboards with a dull thud. He placed his large, scarred hand flat against the center of the wooden door and pushed forward. The rusted hinges screamed in a high-pitched, agonizing wail as the door slowly swung inward, revealing an abyss of absolute darkness. He stepped over the threshold. The air inside the hidden room was incredibly thick, completely stagnant, and heavy with the overpowering aroma of ancient things. The sharp, unmistakable scent of dried linseed oil, aged turpentine, crumbling varnish, and decomposing canvas rushed into his lungs, instantly transporting him back to memories of a past he could barely comprehend. He raised his battery-powered flashlight, cutting a narrow, dusty beam of white light through the suffocating gloom. The room was completely packed.
Leaning against the yellowed plaster walls were dozens upon dozens of empty, ornate wooden picture frames, some coated in flaking gold leaf, others carved from dark, heavy mahogany. Dust motes danced lazily in the beam of his flashlight as he carefully navigated through the narrow, chaotic pathways of discarded art supplies, broken easels, and dried paint tubes. Yet it was not the empty frames that captured his undivided attention. It was the far corner of the room. Deep in the shadows, resting securely on top of sturdy wooden pallets raised 6 inches off the damp floor, sat a massive rectangular shape. It was meticulously covered by a heavy gray canvas tarp, perfectly squared off and stacked to the height of a man's chest. The careful, deliberate nature of the arrangement stood in stark, jarring contrast to the chaotic mess of the surrounding room. Someone had gone to great lengths to protect whatever was hidden beneath that faded fabric. Harrison walked slowly towards it. His breath plumed in the freezing air, his pulse remaining entirely calm and steady as he reached out with his rough, scarred fingers. He grabbed the frayed corner of the heavy canvas tarp, feeling the coarse, dusty fibers against his skin. He pulled it backward in one smooth, sweeping motion, sending a massive cloud of dust billowing into the air around him. He froze completely. There, stacked with incredible precision, were dozens of large framed canvases, each one meticulously wrapped in heavy layers of brown archival paper and tied with thick jute twine. He carefully untied the knot on the closest piece, gently peeling back the protective paper, revealing a breathtaking oil painting of a sprawling ancient southern plantation house bathed in golden light. The brush strokes were masterful, the colors vibrant and alive despite the passage of time. But the true shock didn't come from the sheer beauty of the artwork itself. It was the name. Harrison lowered his flashlight, his breathing stopping entirely as the beam illuminated a faded brown ink signature perfectly preserved in the bottom right corner of the canvas.
The signature read Solomon Vale. Harrison stared at the faded brown ink, his rough thumb hovering a fraction of an inch above the canvas. He knew that name. He had heard it whispered in the dark, freezing winters of his childhood by a mother who scrubbed floors for 50 cents an hour until her knuckles bled. Solomon Vale was the estranged grandfather he had never once met, a ghost of a man who had abandoned his family for the agonizing, poverty-stricken pursuit of oil painting. It made no sense. There were at least 40 canvases stacked in the freezing room, each measuring roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, wrapped in thick archival paper that smelled heavily of mold and forgotten decades. If these were truly the lost works of his grandfather, they represented a lifetime of frantic, desperate labor. Harrison did not drop to his knees in joyous rapture, nor did he let out a triumphant shout of sudden victory to the empty ceiling. He was a man composed of calluses and quiet endurance. He simply covered the painting. He carefully tied the thick jute twine back into a tight knot, ensuring the canvas was protected from the freezing 32-degree draft blowing through the shattered window panes. He had exactly $100 left to his name, no running water, no electricity, and a massive 2,000-square-foot workshop that required immediate, backbreaking salvation. Art did not keep a man warm. Sweat did. He went to work. For the next 7 days, Harrison subjected his 71-year-old body to an agonizing, relentless routine of brutal physical labor. He awoke every morning at 4 o'clock, rising from the cold plastic tarp long before the winter sun breached the horizon. He walked 2 miles to the local hardware store, using $30 of his remaining cash to purchase heavy grit sandpaper, a spool of heavy-duty copper electrical wire, basic hand tools, and a gallon of industrial wood glue. He carried the heavy canvas bag of supplies back on his shoulders, his boots crushing the frozen morning dew on the cracked sidewalks. He began with the walls. Armed with nothing but a wooden block wrapped in coarse 80-grit sandpaper, Harrison started stripping the decaying yellowed paint from the towering 10-foot walls of the main studio. He worked with a methodical, rhythmic precision of a machine, sliding the abrasive block up and down the pine boards, sending thick clouds of toxic, decades-old dust raining down upon his hair and shoulders.
His shoulders burned with a vicious stabbing ache, his forearms cramped violently, and his lungs processed the stale air with heavy, labored breaths. He did not stop. While Preston sat in a plush leather chair drafting fraudulent legal briefs and Eleanor drank imported wine in a climate-controlled dining room, Harrison ground his knuckles against the rough timber. He sanded an incredible 800 square feet of wall space entirely by hand, revealing the pale, beautiful, and completely undamaged pine wood hidden beneath the filth. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his filthy sleeve. He tackled the electricity next. The old breaker box was a rusted, dangerous nightmare of frayed wires and blown fuses that had not seen a current in 9 years. Harrison spent 12 hours standing on a rickety wooden step stool, his stiff fingers carefully stripping the rubber insulation from the ends of the new copper wire. He ran over 200 feet of fresh electrical cable through the dark, narrow crawl space above the ceiling joists, dragging his chest across the rough plaster and inhaling 50 years of accumulated dust. He reconnected the primary circuits, twisted the copper ends together, and capped them tight. He flipped the main switch. A loud hum vibrated through the walls, followed instantly by the warm, brilliant glow of 6 overhead glass bulbs illuminating the massive workshop for the first time in a decade. It was a small, silent victory, paid for entirely in blood, sweat, and cracked fingernails. The light revealed the sheer magnitude of the task ahead, illuminating thousands of deep scratches in the floor and a dozen broken window panes that let in the bitter 40-degree wind. He kept moving forward. He spent 2 entire days repairing the massive front windows, painstakingly scraping away the petrified window glazing with a dull putty knife. He measured the empty frames down to the 16th of an inch, scrounged discarded glass panels from an abandoned salvage yard 3 miles away, and cut them to size with a cheap scoring tool. He sealed the new glass tight against the harsh Kentucky winter, locking the warmth inside his fortress of wood and silence. He was starving. His diet consisted entirely of stale bread and tap water from a rusty sink in the back room, causing his heavy frame to lose 6 pounds in a single week. Yet his stoic, relentless labor had not gone completely unnoticed by the few remaining locals of the dying town. On the 8th morning, an elderly woman in a heavy wool coat cautiously approached the newly repaired front door. She owned the struggling bakery down the street and had watched the old man working tirelessly through the frozen nights. "I brought you some hot coffee and a loaf of fresh sourdough," she said softly, handing him a warm paper bag with a deeply sympathetic smile. "Thank you, ma'am," Harrison replied evenly, accepting the food with a polite, dignified nod. Later that afternoon, a mechanic in grease-stained overalls walked over from the adjacent garage, carrying 2 massive, heavy-duty space heaters. He set them down on the maple floorboards, noting the incredibly clean, newly sanded walls with an expression of genuine, profound respect. He plugged the heaters into the newly wired outlets, filling the icy room with a sudden, glorious blast of radiant heat. "Nobody works like that anymore," the mechanic muttered quietly, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. Harrison merely nodded. He ate the warm sourdough bread in silence, sitting on an overturned wooden milk crate in the center of the illuminated studio. The space was beginning to look like a sanctuary, a cathedral of raw timber and honest labor. It was only when his physical chores for the day were entirely complete that he allowed his mind to wander back to the hidden, locked room at the end of the dark corridor. He walked back into the vault. The space heaters had slowly begun to warm the stagnant air in the storage room, carrying the heavy scent of turpentine directly into his nostrils. He did not touch the wrapped canvases again. Instead, his sharp eyes scanned the dark corners, looking for any indication of how these paintings had survived the decades. Tucked away beneath a rotting wooden workbench, completely obscured by a pile of empty paint cans, he spotted a small, dark shape. It was a heavy, military-style metal lockbox. Harrison pulled the heavy box out of the shadows, dragging it across the floorboards. The metal was severely pitted with rust, and the brass latch was completely fused shut from years of moisture. He gripped his heavy steel crowbar, wedged the forged tip under the brass lock, and applied a sudden, violent downward force. The metal snapped loudly, and the heavy lid flew open, crashing against the floor. He knelt beside it. Inside the box, carefully preserved within a thick, waterproof leather portfolio, were a stack of yellowed, fragile documents. Harrison wiped his dirty hands on his denim jeans before reaching down to pick up the very first sheet of paper. It was a heavy piece of legal parchment, stamped with the official raised seal of a notary public from the state of New York. The date typed at the top of the page read October 14th, 1989. He began to read. The legal jargon was dense and extremely complicated, vastly different from the deceptive, fraudulent contracts his son Preston had used to steal his livelihood. This document was a masterfully crafted, ironclad declaration of inheritance, drafted by a high-level estate attorney decades ago. It meticulously detailed the existence of a massive, hidden collection of oil paintings, specifically cataloging over 50 original works by the artist Solomon Vale. Harrison scanned the text. The document explicitly stated that the entire collection, along with all associated intellectual property rights, reproduction rights, and future dividends, was to be placed in a blind trust. It stated that the collection was never to be sold or divided by creditors. Most importantly, it contained a single, undeniable clause that dictated the absolute legal transfer of ownership. The words were typed in bold ink. The legal text stated that the sole rightful heir to this priceless, hidden legacy was the direct, living descendant of Miriam Vale Reed. Harrison stopped breathing. Miriam Vale Reed was his mother. She was the woman who died with nothing but $50 to her name, leaving him nothing but a cardboard box of keepsakes. She had lived a life of brutal, agonizing poverty, completely unaware that she was the legal owner of a massive, hidden fortune of fine art. His hands trembled slightly. He carefully placed the fragile yellow document back into the waterproof leather portfolio. He sat back on his heels, the cold, hard reality of the situation washing over him like a tidal wave of ice water. His treacherous ex-wife and his arrogant, deceitful son had spent years meticulously plotting to steal a successful carpentry business and 5 acres of land, completely convinced they had taken his entire life's worth. They left him with $114, laughing behind his back as they drove him into the freezing street. They had no idea. Harrison stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a massive dark shadow against the newly illuminated walls of the hidden room. He looked at the stacks of wrapped canvases, seeing them not as simple paintings, but as the enduring, indestructible spirit of his bloodline. He realized his poor, suffering mother had carried a truly great historical identity, an identity that had been buried in the dust for decades. The silence was heavy.
He walked back out to the main studio, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. He needed absolute, undeniable proof of what he had found, and he needed someone who understood the ruthless, cutthroat world of fine art valuation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cheap, cracked cell phone, dialing a number he had found on a rusted billboard 3 miles outside of town. He waited for the ringing to stop. Harrison stood quietly in the center of the massive room, realizing that his poor mother had carried a truly great identity. But the true, staggering value of these forgotten paintings was so incredibly massive that he found himself instinctively holding his breath as he waited for a renowned expert to finally walk through his freshly painted front door.
The heavy oak door of the law office swung open, admitting a gust of 40 degrees Fahrenheit wind into the quiet, perfectly organized reception area. Harrison walked past the expensive leather chairs, carrying the 20-pound metal lockbox under his arm as if it weighed absolutely nothing. He had driven 12 miles across the county line to find a legal mind completely disconnected from the poisonous, intertwined network of his son. He found Beatrice Baines. She was a woman of sharp angles, silver hair, and absolute unshakable composure. She did not waste time. She sat behind a massive mahogany desk, her piercing eyes scanning the fragile yellow document from 1989 with the predatory focus of a seasoned inheritance lawyer. She spent 3 exhaustive hours running the archaic legal phrasing through modern federal property databases, state probate archives, complex tax statutes, and historical birth records. She traced the direct bloodline of Miriam Vale Reed, navigating through decades of forgotten census data, faded marriage certificates, and obscure trusts. She slowly removed her reading glasses. "This is completely ironclad," Beatrice stated quietly, her voice carrying a profound weight. "Your grandfather created a blind, impenetrable trust specifically designed to bypass all creditors, spouses, and external claims. As the sole surviving descendant, you are the absolute, undisputed owner of the entire estate." Harrison did not smile. He simply nodded his head, his calloused hands resting calmly on the polished wooden table. He had secured the legal fortress, but the true, tangible value of the inheritance still remained locked inside a dark room smelling of mold and turpentine. He thanked Beatrice, paid her initial retainer using the very last $40 in his worn wallet, and drove his battered truck back to the studio. He was expecting a visitor. Silas Mercer arrived precisely at noon, stepping out of a sleek black sedan that looked entirely out of place in the ruined, forgotten alleyway of Blackwood. Silas was an independent art curator, a man who had spent his entire life studying brushstrokes, chemical pigment degradation, and the historical provenance of Southern masters. He wore a heavy wool coat against the biting cold, his eyes darting nervously around the freshly sanded 2,000-square-foot workshop. Harrison led him to the vault. The air inside the hidden room was now a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit, thanks to the heavy-duty space heaters buzzing quietly in the corners. Silas stepped carefully over the threshold, his eyes immediately locking on to the massive tarp-covered shapes elevated 6 inches off the damp floorboards. Harrison stepped forward, his heavy hands gripping the thick jute twine of the closest bundle. He pulled the paper back. Silas gasped aloud, his knees physically buckling as the vibrant golden light of the painted southern plantation house struck his eyes. He stumbled forward, pulling a small, high-powered magnifying glass from his coat pocket, his hands trembling violently. He hovered mere inches from the canvas, scrutinizing the masterful blending of oil pigments, the microscopic cracking of the aged varnish, and the distinct, unmistakable geometry of the architectural lines. He was utterly speechless. Solomon Vale was considered the lost genius of the Southern Renaissance, Silas whispered breathlessly, his voice shaking with pure adrenaline. Historians believed his entire collection was completely destroyed in a massive warehouse fire in 1972. These are not just paintings, Mr. Caldwell. These are the missing pages of American art history. "What is the condition?" Harrison asked plainly. Silas spent the next 4 agonizingly slow hours unwrapping, measuring, and cataloging every single canvas in the freezing room. He examined 36-inch by 48-inch landscapes, heavy mahogany frames, and delicate, masterful portraits of long-forgotten historical figures. He wept silently as he brushed a century of dust off a pristine, untouched masterpiece, marveling at the museum-quality preservation achieved by the heavy archival paper and the dark, dry environment. He finally stood up. "The preservation is absolutely miraculous," Silas stated firmly, wiping a tear from his cheek. At a major auction house in New York or London, a single authenticated piece by Solomon Vale of this magnitude would easily command a starting bid of $2 million. Harrison stared at the 40 wrapped canvases. He did not drop to his knees in joyous rapture, nor did he let out a triumphant shout to the empty ceiling. He simply calculated the immense, staggering weight of the numbers in his quiet, stoic mind. 32 years of backbreaking carpentry had built a tiny, fragile empire that his deceitful family had stolen in a single afternoon.
Now, standing in a $14 ruined building, he was staring at a collection easily valued at over $80 million. He was a silent billionaire. "We must move these to a secure, climate-controlled vault immediately," Silas urged frantically, his eyes darting towards the broken street outside. "The insurance premiums alone will be staggering, and the art world will tear itself apart the very second this discovery goes public." "No," Harrison replied coldly. He looked around the raw wooden walls of his new sanctuary. He had poured his own sweat into this foundation, bleeding over the pine studs and freezing on the hard maple floors. This dilapidated $14 ruin was the only honest place he had left in the entire world, and he refused to let his grandfather's legacy be locked away in a sterile corporate bank vault thousands of miles away. He would build the gallery here. Yet the explosive, earth-shattering news of an $80 million art discovery in a dying Kentucky town could not be contained by simple wooden walls and fresh glass windows. The scent of enormous wealth began to drift on the bitter winter wind, crossing county lines and reaching the polished high-rise offices of those who traded in greed. The vultures caught the scent. Information regarding the massive, unprecedented appraisal inevitably leaked from the secure auction house databases, spreading like wildfire through the ruthless, cutthroat networks of high society lawyers and estate planners. The staggering numbers flashed across glowing computer screens, catching the sharp, predatory eyes of a man in a custom-tailored navy blue suit. News of the massive fortune could not stay hidden for long, and the overpowering smell of sudden, immense wealth rapidly summoned the vultures back, setting the stage for a vicious, cold-blooded legal conspiracy designed to strip him of everything once again.
The scent of fresh sawdust and hot coffee was suddenly interrupted by the sharp, aggressive screech of expensive rubber tires halting violently on the cracked asphalt outside. The heavy front door swung open, letting a vicious blast of 30 degrees Fahrenheit wind rip through the quiet studio. Preston stormed inside, his custom-tailored navy blue suit completely out of place against the raw pine studs and heavy maple floorboards. Eleanor followed closely behind him, her eyes darting greedily around the massive 2,000-square-foot space as if she already owned every single square inch. They had smelled the blood. "You used marital assets to purchase this rotting pile of garbage," Preston declared viciously, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "That $114 came from a joint account, Dad. By state law, 50% of everything in this building belongs to my mother, and we are prepared to freeze the entire $80 million in litigation until you die." Harrison did not stop working. He stood calmly at his sturdy wooden workbench, using a heavy steel hand plane to shave micro-thin curls of rich walnut wood. He blew the dust from the grain, wiped his calloused hands on his faded denim apron, and looked dead into his son's arrogant, venomous eyes. He did not yell, curse, or beg for peace. "Get out," he muttered coldly. 3 weeks later, the brutal, sterile fluorescent lights of the county courthouse illuminated the stark contrast between the two sides of the aisle. Preston and Eleanor sat confidently behind the plaintiff's table, armed with towering stacks of legal precedents, aggressive motions, and a burning, insatiable greed. Harrison sat perfectly still beside Beatrice, his posture straight, his rough hands resting quietly on his knees. The gavel fell. Preston launched into a highly aggressive, deeply theatrical monologue, arguing that the $14 real estate transaction was heavily subsidized by the marriage. He demanded immediate receivership of the artwork, painting his father as a mentally declining, desperate old man who was hiding massive marital assets. He smiled smugly as he concluded his opening statement, fully expecting an easy, immediate surrender. Beatrice stood up slowly.
She approached the heavy oak podium with the lethal, calculating silence of a master executioner, carrying a single manila folder. She did not argue about the $14, nor did she dispute the timeline of the real estate purchase. Instead, she smoothly handed a certified, heavily stamped document directly to the presiding judge, completely bypassing the marital asset argument. The collection was not purchased, Beatrice stated clearly, her voice cutting through the silent room like a razor blade. It was inherited by direct, unbroken bloodline through a blind trust established in 1989, making it an entirely separate, non-marital asset completely immune to any divorce decree. Preston's smug smile vanished. He scrambled to his feet, objecting wildly and waving his hands, but Beatrice was far from finished. She reached into her folder and produced a thick, intimidating stack of printed papers, distributing copies to the judge, the bailiff, and finally dropping a set heavily onto Preston's desk. It was a comprehensive, undeniable chain of leaked internal emails, carefully extracted from the server of Preston's own law firm. The room stopped breathing. The emails detailed with sickening chronological precision the exact conspiracy Preston and Eleanor had engineered to illegally siphon the 5-acre property and the lucrative carpentry business away from Harrison. They discussed forged signatures, hidden offshore accounts, and the deliberate, calculated manipulation of an elderly man. It was absolute, undeniable proof of massive, systemic financial fraud. "This is completely inadmissible," Preston stammered weakly. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, the deafening crack echoing violently against the marble walls and silencing the treacherous lawyer instantly. The judge stared at the emails, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked down at Eleanor, whose pristine white coat suddenly seemed like a cheap, pathetic costume, and then locked his furious eyes onto Preston. The verdict was absolute. The judge dismissed the civil claim entirely, stripping them of any legal right to the $80 million, and immediately ordered the bailiff to forward the explosive email evidence to the State Bar Association and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for severe criminal prosecution. The towering, arrogant lawyer physically collapsed into his leather chair, burying his pale, sweating face in his trembling hands as his entire career evaporated into thin air. Karma had arrived. The heavy wooden doors of the humiliating courtroom slammed firmly shut on the greedy traitors, opening onto a brilliant setting sun where Harrison stood ready to orchestrate an event that would forever alter the history of the small town.
Harrison did not celebrate his massive, undeniable legal victory with expensive champagne or a lavish dinner in a high-rise restaurant. He walked out of the towering county courthouse, his heavy work boots striking the concrete steps with the exact same slow, measured rhythm he had maintained for 32 years. He did not look back at the shattered, humiliating ruins of his son's legal career, nor did he spare a single thought for the venomous ex-wife who had tried to strip his bones bare. He simply adjusted his faded denim jacket against the biting 50-degree Fahrenheit wind, climbed into the torn vinyl seat of his rusted pickup truck, and turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life. He drove 17 miles out of the Blackwood town center, leaving the crowded streets behind for a winding, desolate country road flanked by dying oak trees. He did not drive toward the massive 5-acre estate that rightfully belonged to him, nor did he head back to the warmth of his newly restored art studio. He pulled the creaking truck into the cracked asphalt parking lot of Rosehaven, a state-funded assisted living facility that smelled overwhelmingly of bleach, boiled vegetables, and quiet despair. He walked through the sliding glass doors. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a sickly, irritating frequency, casting long, pale shadows down the endless corridors of peeling linoleum flooring.
Harrison navigated the depressing maze with stoic purpose, his towering frame dwarfing the fragile rolling medical carts and the exhausted, underpaid nursing staff. He stopped outside a tiny, cramped room measuring barely 12 feet by 12 feet, entirely devoid of any personal warmth or sunlight. He gently pushed the door open. Sitting in a worn vinyl wheelchair by a small barred window was Martha, the elderly woman who had officially sold him the abandoned picture framing studio for exactly $14. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds, her skin as thin and translucent as ancient parchment, her shaking hands resting quietly on her lap in the cold, sterile air. Harrison stepped into the room, pulling a cheap plastic visitor chair up beside her with the utmost gentleness. "Mr. Caldwell," she whispered softly, her voice shaking like a dry leaf. "I came to thank you, Martha," Harrison replied evenly, his deep voice filling the small, depressing room with a profound sense of solid grounding. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and quietly explained the massive $80 million discovery hidden entirely behind the rusted padlock she had sworn to protect. Martha closed her clouded eyes, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her deeply wrinkled face as she recounted the solemn promise she had made to his desperate mother nearly 40 decades ago. She had sworn to keep that heavy oak door permanently locked, completely untouched by the greedy hands of the outside world, until the rightful bloodline returned to claim it. She had kept her word. Harrison stood up slowly, gently placing his large, heavily calloused hand over her frail, shaking fingers for a brief moment of profound gratitude. He walked directly out of the cramped room and marched straight down the long corridor, pushing the heavy wooden door of the head administrator's office open without knocking. The facility director, a sharply dressed man drowning in endless insurance paperwork, looked up with profound irritation at the massive, dust-covered carpenter standing in his doorway. Harrison did not mince words. Using a newly established titanium-clad line of credit securely backed by the massive Solomon Vale estate, he quietly executed a staggering financial transaction right on the director's desk. He demanded an immediate transfer for Martha into the absolute finest 500-square-foot private suite the facility offered, complete with 24-hour specialized nursing care, premium organic meals, and fresh floral arrangements to be delivered every single morning. He paid the exorbitant six-figure medical fees completely in advance, covering the absolute remainder of her natural life down to the very last penny. He bought her absolute peace. Returning to his 2,000-square-foot sanctuary in the alleyway, Harrison traded his heavy jacket for a heavy leather apron, breathing in the glorious, familiar scent of raw timber and hot coffee. The $80 million sitting securely in his trust account meant absolutely nothing to the deep ingrained calluses on his hands. The masterful canvases of his grandfather required frames, and Harrison fundamentally refused to let another man's hands touch the final, crucial presentation of his family's hidden legacy. He went straight to work. He meticulously sorted through a massive delivery of premium, kiln-dried black walnut boards, running his rough thumbs across the dense, dark grain to check for any microscopic imperfections, knots, or warping. He set the heavy cast-iron table saw to a perfectly precise angle, the steel blade spinning with terrifying, deafening power as he pushed the heavy wood through the screaming teeth. He measured, cut, glued, clamped, sanded, and polished each individual frame, completely losing himself in the sacred, repetitive rhythm of honest, backbreaking labor. It was a stoic meditation. He spent 4 entire days shaping over 300 linear feet of flawless walnut, perfectly framing the priceless historical masterpieces with the quiet, dignified skill of a man who truly understood the weight of time.
When the final piece of glass was carefully secured and the last drop of orange oil polish was wiped away, he wiped his sweating brow and picked up the keys to his truck. There was one final necessary piece required to complete the restoration of his shattered life. He drove 5 miles to a dying diner. Sitting behind the greasy, stained coffee counter was Dorothy, a remarkably sharp, fiercely loyal woman in her late 50s who had served as the primary manager of his old carpentry business for 12 years. Eleanor had ruthlessly fired her without a single cent of severance pay the very moment the fraudulent divorce papers were filed, leaving her elderly woman entirely destitute and struggling to pay her monthly rent. Dorothy looked up from a stack of dirty porcelain coffee cups, her exhausted eyes widening in absolute shock as Harrison's towering frame filled the narrow doorway of the diner. "I need a gallery director," Harrison stated calmly. He did not offer her simply a job. He offered her a massive, ironclad contract with full health benefits, an enormous salary that quadrupled her previous earnings, and absolute unchecked authority over the daily operations of the Solomon Vale collection. Dorothy dropped the damp rag she had held onto the greasy floor, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a sudden, overwhelming sob of pure relief. She had been drowning in debt, crushed by the ruthless cruelty of her ex-wife, and now he was pulling her completely out of the suffocating darkness. Karma worked both ways. The humiliating heavy wooden doors of the county courthouse had permanently closed on the greedy, pathetic traitors who had tried to destroy his life, leaving them to rot in their own deceit. Those closed doors simultaneously opened up to a brilliant, fiery sunset bleeding across the black-wood horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the freshly painted exterior of the abandoned building. Harrison stood quietly in the twilight. He carefully wiped the last speck of sawdust from his rough, scarred hands, staring out into the fading light as he prepared for an unprecedented, earth-shattering event that would forever alter the history of the small town.
The freezing, brutal winter finally broke, yielding a crisp 50-degree Fahrenheit spring morning that carried the faint scent of blooming dogwood trees through the streets of Blackwood. The dilapidated, forgotten alleyway was completely unrecognizable. A massive line of eager, wealthy patrons wrapped around the entire city block, stretching for hundreds of yards past the rusted fences and boarded-up gas stations. They wore expensive silk scarves and tailored wool coats, waiting patiently outside the freshly painted, pristine white exterior of a building that had once been a rotting corpse. It was a masterpiece. Above the solid oak double doors, a hand-carved mahogany sign read Vale House Studio in elegant, perfectly balanced gold leaf lettering. The $14 pile of garbage had been meticulously, agonizingly resurrected from the ashes by a pair of scarred, heavily calloused hands. Inside the massive 2,000-square-foot gallery, the air was comfortably warm and smelled faintly of expensive coffee and fresh orange oil polish. Soft, warm amber track lighting illuminated the towering 10-foot pine walls, casting a perfect museum-quality glow upon the staggering $80 million collection. Dorothy stood confidently in the center of the room. She wore a sharply tailored black dress, speaking with absolute, undeniable authority to a group of prestigious museum curators from New York who were desperately trying to broker an exhibition. The vibrant landscapes and haunting portraits of Solomon Vale breathed life back into the dying town, drawing a massive, highly lucrative wave of tourism and profound historical respect. Harrison did not mingle with the billionaires. He stood quietly in the front entrance hall, completely ignoring the flashing cameras of the press and the wealthy collectors offering massive checks for a single painting. He wore the exact same faded flannel shirt and worn denim jeans he had worn on the freezing night he was violently thrown out into the street.
He held a small, heavy brass hammer in his right hand, gently tapping a final 1-inch steel nail into the solid maple paneling right beside the heavy front door. He hung a simple frame. Inside the rich walnut border rested a faded black-and-white photograph of Miriam Whale Reed, his impoverished, suffering mother, standing beside a blurry, distant image of the enigmatic Solomon Vale. It was the only piece in the entire building absolutely not for sale, a silent, profound monument to the bloodline that had endured decades of crushing poverty to finally reach this exact, glorious moment. "The gallery is entirely full," whispered Dorothy emotionally, stepping up beside him. "Let them in," Harrison replied calmly. He stepped back, his heavy work boots resting squarely on the floorboards he had painstakingly sanded entirely by hand. 32 years of backbreaking labor had been stolen by greedy, pathetic cowards, leaving him with absolutely nothing but $114 and an old, dying truck. Yet, standing in the glowing warmth of his true, undisputed home, the 71-year-old master carpenter felt a deep, profound sense of absolute completion that no amount of stolen wealth could ever buy. He watched the brilliant sunlight filter through the flawlessly restored glass panes, listening to the hushed, reverent whispers of the crowd, admiring his family's incredible history. The storm had finally passed. From 14 pathetic dollars, mocked by the entire world, this wooden sanctuary had undeniably proven a profound, eternal truth. Your greatest value is never determined by the fragile, temporary things that greedy men can ruthlessly strip away, but it forever lies within the indestructible legacy you are resilient enough to ignite from the absolute depths of the ashes.